When I first entered that house, I thought I was alone, but a few hours later I realized I wasn't even the second person living in that house. This story begins with a newly graduated teacher being appointed to a village that is hard to find even on maps. But the real issue wasn't the village, it was the house given to her, because in that house, there was someone who once lived there, and that someone had not left. When the bus stopped at the entrance of the village, it was the final hours of the evening. The sky was pale, gray clouds seemed to have swallowed the sun entirely. The other passengers inside had already gotten off. The driver looked at me through the mirror. "Last stop," he said in a short, cold voice. I nodded, took my suitcase, and stepped down. The moment my foot touched the ground, a strange sensation washed over me. It was as if this place didn't want me. The bus moved away slowly behind me. As the engine noise faded, the silence settling over the village became even more pronounced. Few seconds later, no sound remained, nothing, no birdsong, no wind, nothing. It was a silence contrary to nature. I looked around. The village was smaller than I expected. Old stone houses, narrow roads, and a small school building standing alone in the distance. Everything was pale. It was as if the colors had abandoned this place years ago. I took a deep breath. "You'll get used to it," I whispered to myself. But the unease inside me didn't fade. I began walking slowly toward the center of the village. I passed in front of a few houses. I noticed shadows moving behind the curtains. Someone was watching me, in fact, more than one person. But no one came out, no one said welcome, no one spoke. It was as if my being there was something unwanted. When I reached the school, the door was ajar. I went inside. The corridor was narrow and dark. My footsteps echoed, "Hello." I called out, no answer. I took another step, then I heard a voice, "You're late." I froze. I turned around slowly. An old man was standing by the door. I hadn't realized where he came from. He wasn't there a moment ago. "The new teacher," I said. The man nodded. "Elif Haja was before you." It was the first time I had heard the name. "Where is she now?" I asked. The man's expression didn't change. "She didn't leave." There was a short pause. "She's gone." This answer was strange. What did that mean? But I didn't ask further. The man took an old key from his pocket and handed it to me. "The house where you'll stay." I took the key. "It was cold. It's close to the school," he said. Then he stepped a bit closer to me. He was so close I could feel his breath. But the weird thing was he had no breath. "If you hear a noise at night," he whispered, "don't open the door." My heart almost stopped. "Why?" I asked. The man stepped back. "Because then they will call for you too." After saying this, he turned and started walking. This time I paid attention. There were no footsteps. Finding the house wasn't difficult. It was a bit outside the village. It stood alone, further away from the other houses. Its surroundings were empty. No neighbors, no light, no sound. I stood in front of the door. A voice inside me said, "Go back." But I had nowhere to go back to. I put the key in the lock. The door opened slowly. The moment I stepped inside, a heavy scent filled my nose. Damp, old, and there was something else beneath it, like something had rotted. I closed the door. The house was dark, but not messy. On the contrary, it was too orderly, as if someone had just left. There was a glass on the table with water inside. There was no dust. This was not possible. I moved forward slowly. Old photographs were hanging on the walls. I approached one, a man and a child beside him. The man's face was clear, but the child's face was gone, as if someone had intentionally scratched it out right at that moment. A sound came from upstairs, footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps. I froze. I held my breath. I was supposed to be alone in the house, but I wasn't. There was something upstairs, and that thing knew I had arrived. When I stood at the base of the stairs, the silence inside the house was no longer just silence. It was as if something was holding its breath, waiting for me to take a step. Those dragging footsteps from above stopped suddenly, and this cessation was more unsettling than the sound itself. I placed my hand on the wooden banister. Under my fingers was a cold and slightly damp surface, as if this house absorbed not just the air but everything you touched. I took the first step slowly. The wood creaked slightly, and at that moment my heart began to beat faster, as if trying to drown out that sound. Second step, third step, and with every step, the darkness above grew a bit larger, a bit heavier. Right when I reached the middle of the stairs, I heard a very faint sound from above. This wasn't a footstep. It was more like something sliding across the floor, as if someone wasn't walking but dragging themselves. I paused. I held my breath. That sound repeated, this time closer. I fixed my eyes on the top of the stairs, but I could see nothing but darkness. I searched for a light switch, ran my fingers along the wall, but there was nothing. It was as if no light had been considered for the upper floor of this house. Is anyone there? I called out. My voice came out lower than I expected. It was as if speaking loudly in this house was forbidden. No answer. But in that moment I realized when I spoke, the thing above had also stopped moving. It was as if it was listening to me. For a moment I thought about turning back, going down, opening the door and leaving, but my feet wouldn't move. There was a strange curiosity inside me, like an obligation mixed with fear. It was as if I couldn't leave this house without seeing what it was. I took another step. I reached the top of the stairs. The upper floor was completely dark. The pale light coming from below only illuminated an area of a few steps. Everything else was lost in the blackness. At that moment, I heard a very faint breathing sound from my right. I froze. This sound definitely didn't belong to me. I turned my head slowly to the right. I tried to make something out in the darkness, but even as my eyes adjusted, nothing became clear. There was just a shape. Something that stood still but was definitely there. "Someone is there, come out," I said, my voice a bit firmer this time, but I couldn't hide the fear inside me. The shape didn't move, but something happened. The darkness where that shape was seemed to thicken slightly. As if it were absorbing the light, I took a step back. The wood creaked again. And at that moment, that thing moved, but not by walking. It was as if it had suddenly arrived a bit closer to where it was. I didn't see how it happened, just. It was closer now. My heart raced. I couldn't take my eyes off it. This wasn't a human. Its height was taller than normal. Its shoulders were narrow, but it had a torso that stretched downward. The most terrifying part was that I couldn't make out its face. Where the face should have been, there was only a void. Suddenly, a very weak light filtered through the upstairs window. The moon, emerging from behind the clouds, illuminated the area for a few seconds, and I saw it. Its face truly wasn't there, as if someone had erased that part. A flat, expressionless void. But despite this, I knew it was looking at me. I wanted to pull back, but my foot caught on the edge of the step. I lost my balance and slid down several stairs. I managed to stop abruptly. My head was spinning. I looked up again. It wasn't there. For a moment, I was relieved. But this relief lasted only a second, because right behind me, right in my ear, I heard a voice. "You're late." My body froze. I couldn't breathe. I tried to turn my head slowly, but my neck felt locked. That thing was no longer upstairs. It was behind me. Suddenly, I threw myself forward and ran down the stairs. My steps were uncontrolled. I almost fell, but I didn't stop. When I got to the ground floor, there was no sound coming from behind me. This was even worse. I ran toward the door. I opened the door and burst outside. The cold air hit my face. I was out of breath. I turned back and looked at the house. In the upstairs window, something was standing, a motionless silhouette behind the curtain. And this time I was sure it had no face, but it was watching me. In that moment, the old man's words came to my mind. "If you hear a noise at night, don't open the door." I hadn't opened it, but it was already inside. I stayed like that in front of the door for a while. I didn't want to go back in. But the outside didn't feel safe either. The village was completely plunged into darkness. There wasn't a single light. It was as if everyone had disappeared at once. And then I realized it wasn't just that house looking at me from the village. In the distance, in the windows of other houses, there were dark silhouettes too, motionless, silent, watching. I wasn't alone. But this was not a good thing at all. That night, I was either going to go back into that house, or I was going to start understanding what this village really was. And I had a feeling, whichever I chose, there was no turning back anymore. I don't know how long I stood in front of the door. Time seemed to flow differently in this village, or perhaps not at all, because in that wait, which felt like mere seconds, I was trapped between the urge to flee and the impulse to turn back. But eventually, I realized that staying outside was not as safe as I had thought. Those motionless silhouettes in the dark windows of the surrounding houses seemed to grow more distinct, as if the longer I stood there, the more they grew accustomed to me, studying me, waiting for my next move. As the cold air stung my lungs, I instinctively turned back toward the house. That figure in the upstairs window was still there, and this time I was certain of one thing. It wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me. With that thought, I opened the door again and went inside, because the uncertainty outside felt more uncontrollable than the terror within. The moment I closed the door, the scent inside the house grew heavier, as if something had moved while I was out and further fouled the air. I leaned my back against the door, closed my eyes for a few seconds, and tried to steady my breathing. But right then, I heard a very faint sound from the depths of the house. It wasn't a footstep, it was more like a whisper, but the words were indistinguishable. You could only tell that someone was speaking. I opened my eyes and slowly turned my head toward the source of the sound. The darkness at the end of the corridor seemed denser, as if something was standing there but choosing not to reveal itself. "Who is in this house?" I asked, but this time my voice was more to myself, as I realized I didn't actually want an answer. No reply came, but the whispering ceased for a moment before the house plunged back into that suffocating silence. This silence could no longer deceive me, for I knew it was the silence of something waiting for the right moment to move. I began walking slowly down the corridor, taking each step more carefully this time, as if every small sound in the house was a summons. My eyes caught the photographs on the walls again, and I looked more closely. The same man repeated in photos taken from different angles, but the child's face was erased in the same way in every single one. This couldn't be a coincidence. It was intentional. Whoever did this either wanted to forget that child or, on the contrary, wanted to ensure no one else could remember him. As I took another step, my foot caught on an old rug spread on the floor. I reached out to the wall to keep my balance, but the moment my hand touched the surface, I felt something strange. The wall wasn't cold. Instead, it was slightly warm, as if something were living behind it. I pulled my hand away instantly, my heart racing again, and that's when I noticed a very faint tapping coming from inside the wall. Irregular, weak, but definitely there. As if someone were trying to get out. I recoiled, my breathing quickening, unable to tear my eyes away from that spot. The tapping stopped abruptly and was replaced by that familiar whisper, closer this time, as if it were coming from right behind the wall. I still couldn't make out the words, but there was something in the tone. It wasn't a warning, it was a calling. In that moment, the old man's words came back to me, and I realized he hadn't just told me not to open the door. He was trying to tell me not to answer certain things in this house. Something was calling me, and if I answered, I didn't know what would happen, but I knew it wouldn't be good. I stepped back slowly and moved toward the other end of the corridor without taking my eyes off the wall. But just then, I felt something move behind me. It wasn't a sound. It was more like the shifting of a presence. I froze, unable to move for several seconds, then gathered my courage and slowly turned my head. There it was at the head of the corridor. It was clearer this time. It had a long, disproportionate body. Its arms were longer than normal, almost touching the floor. But the most terrifying part was still its face, or rather, the lack of one. That area, which looked like a blank, flat surface, was nevertheless watching me, and the sensation of its gaze settled in my stomach like a weight. I wanted to retreat, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing didn't take a step. It wasn't even walking. But a moment later, it was closer again. I couldn't catch this movement with my eyes. I only saw the results. "Who are you?" I whispered. It didn't answer. But at that moment, the tapping from the wall behind me suddenly intensified, as if the thing inside had panicked. There were two different entities, and I was right in the middle. I didn't know which was more dangerous. Suddenly, the lights flickered. The house illuminated for a brief second, and in that fleeting moment, I saw everything. Shapes pressing outward from inside the wall, they looked like human hands. And that thing at the head of the corridor, it wasn't alone. Behind it, there were dozens more just like it. The light went out again. Darkness returned. And in that moment, I understood that this house wasn't just a house. It was a place where things were kept, and I was now caught among them. I held my breath, my heart ringing in my ears, and in that darkness, there was only one thought. I had to get out. But another voice inside me told me that was no longer possible, because those things had already noticed me, and in this village, being noticed meant you would never truly be alone again. When darkness falls, you lose track of how time passes because your eyes have nothing to hold on to, and your mind stops distinguishing between what it sees and what it doesn't. I was in exactly that kind of void, frozen, holding my breath, feeling that if I moved, something would pounce on me. I was trapped between that faceless entity in front of me and the things trying to claw out of the wall behind me. Seconds or perhaps minutes passed, but then a very clear thought formed. Staying here was the same as dying. I suddenly lunged to the side, crashing into the corridor wall, and began fumbling my way forward. The fact that no sound of running came from behind me was even more terrifying. It didn't mean they weren't chasing me, but rather that they didn't need to. Fleeing through the dark, I tripped over something and fell flat on my face. I took a hard hit, but even the pain was a relief. It was the only thing reminding me that I was real. I scrambled up and started running. I didn't know exactly where I was going, but I burst into a room that looked like a kitchen. I noticed a window and tried to open it without a second thought, but it was locked. I strained, pulled, even rammed it with my shoulder, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if this house was built only to keep things in. At that moment, I heard a very faint sound behind me, not a footstep, but the sensation of something approaching, as if the air itself was being displaced. I slowly turned around. It was there in the doorway, but this time it wasn't alone. The darkness behind it was moving as if multiple entities were layered upon one another, not a single shape but a mass. And they were all approaching me at once without taking steps, simply erasing the distance. I backed away until my hand hit the kitchen counter, knocking something over. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the house, and in that instant everything stopped. Literally everything. The entities, the whispers, the movement. It was as if the house was listening to that sound. My heart was pounding wildly, but even I didn't move because I had a very clear feeling. This silence was a test. And then another sound came from within the house. This sound wasn't like theirs. It was more human, faint but clear. "I told you not to come upstairs." I froze. That was a human voice, but where was it coming from? My eyes darted to the door. Those entities were still there, but they no longer seemed to be looking at me. Their attention had shifted elsewhere. In that moment, I realized the voice wasn't coming from inside the house, but from within the walls. I moved slowly toward the voice. I expected the entities to close in with every step, but they didn't. It was as if they were no longer interested in me. I stepped into the corridor and approached the wall where I had heard the tapping earlier. My heart accelerated again. "Who is there?" I whispered. There was a brief silence. Then came the answer, "You're late." The same sentence, the same tone. But this time it was filled with exhaustion. "Teacher Elif," I said instinctively. A very faint laugh came from inside the wall, a painful, broken laugh. "I'm not her anymore." My skin crawled. I took a step back but couldn't look away from the wall. "This isn't a house," the voice said. "This is a door." I caught my breath. "A door to what?" I asked. She didn't answer immediately, as if even speaking was a struggle. "They cannot go out, but if someone sees them, they are never alone again." As I heard this sentence, everything began to click into place. Why the people in the village looked at me but wouldn't speak, why everyone watched from the windows, why this house was far from the others. This house was keeping things inside. And the villagers, they knew. "How do I get out of here?" I asked, my voice trembling. A long silence followed. Then the answer came, "You can't." There was a finality in the voice this time. But then she added, "Not without leaving someone in your place." My heart felt like it stopped. "What does that mean?" I asked, but no answer came. Instead, I heard a voice from behind me. Very close. "She understands." I slowly turned my head. That faceless entity was now only a few steps away. And this time it wasn't alone. I was surrounded. The walls, the floor, the darkness. Those shapes were approaching from everywhere, and I had nowhere left to run. In that moment, I understood. There was only one way out of this house, but choosing that path meant drawing someone else in. A feeling heavier than fear took root inside me. I had to make a choice. Either I would stay here or I would leave someone else in my place. And the most terrifying part was this: everyone in this village had already made their choice. Time didn't stop then. On the contrary, it sped up. My brain produced hundreds of thoughts at once, all converging on a single point. If I wanted to leave this place alive, I couldn't leave as the same person who entered. The faceless entities surrounding me were no longer hiding. They had become distinct in the darkness. Each turned toward me as if sharing a single consciousness, different parts of one whole, and I was about to be pulled into that whole. Breathing became difficult, the air grew heavy, and I realized that fear was no longer something coming from the outside. It had entered me. "You can't leave without leaving someone in your place," the voice from the wall echoed in my mind. No matter how much I tried to reject it, it began to make sense. No one in the village approached this house. No one went out at night because everyone knew what it meant. This wasn't just a curse, it was a cycle. Suddenly, I thought of the bus, the driver, the strange look he gave me as I got off. Did he know? A thought flashed in my mind so suddenly that I instinctively raised my head. My eyes shifted through the entities toward the door. The exit was still there, but it was no longer just a physical exit. It had a condition. "Someone else comes," I whispered to myself. "I can go." The thought resonated within me, and I noticed the entities move. They weren't retreating, but something had changed. It was as if they were listening, waiting for my decision. This house wasn't just a prison, it was a place of selection, and I had to choose. I took a step toward the door, then another. The entities didn't touch me, they simply watched. This was even more chilling because it was a movement they were permitting. I reached the door, my hand went to the handle, but I stopped before opening it. Was I really going to do this? Was I going to knowingly lure someone else here? My chest tightened, but then the whispers from behind me rose, the tapping from inside the wall began again, more violent this time, as if those inside were desperate to get out, as if they were saying either you or us. I closed my eyes, and I opened the door. When I stepped outside, night had fully fallen. The village was lost in the dark, but this time I noticed something. There were no silhouettes in the windows. None. It was as if everyone had hidden, or stopped watching. I began to walk. I didn't know where I was going, but my feet led me to the entrance of the village. It was as if something inside me knew the way. Minutes later, I reached the head of the dirt road and saw a light in the distance, headlights. My heart raced. A vehicle was coming, the same bus, the same route, the same fate. The bus approached, slowed down, and stopped right in front of me. The door opened and the driver looked at me. This time the expression on his face was clearer. He wasn't sad, he wasn't scared, he was just. "Used to it, are you leaving?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. I turned back, I looked at the village, I looked at that house, at the upstairs window, and I saw it. The faceless silhouette behind the curtain was no longer moving, it was just standing there. And this time I understood it wasn't me. Not yet. I turned back to the driver. "Will someone else be coming?" I asked. The driver was silent for a few seconds. Then he gave a slight shrug. "Someone always comes," that answer was enough. I got on the bus. The door closed, the vehicle moved. The village slowly receded, but the feeling inside me didn't fade because I hadn't escaped. I had only vacated my spot. Days passed. I returned to the city. I continued my normal life, but nothing was as it was before. I couldn't sleep at night because sometimes sounds came from the walls, very faint, very deep. And sometimes I felt someone watching me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the message that came to my phone one day.